Hello and welcome to the Orthodox Oasis. My name is Jerome Hieronymus, and what you're about to watch is a VOD of the Orthodox Oasis over on Twitch. So feel free to join us live as we play games, hang out, and chat about Orthodox stuff. Otherwise, enjoy this VOD, and we'll see you soon. Have a great day. Let's listen to one about the American Orthodox Catholic Church. Looks like it's got Matthew, the guy who does the podcast, and Father Andrew Stephen Damick, which would be pretty good. I do like Father.
Hi, this is
Damick.
The Orthodox Church is the historical church, the church of holy tradition. And those who count themselves as Orthodox Christian share a uniquely historical consciousness, understanding that the saints, priests, and Orthodox laymen of the past play a crucial part in their journeys toward salvation. However, there is one area of Orthodox history that very few of us know anything about, the story of Orthodoxy in the Americas. Ancient Faith Radio is thus happy to present American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey. Matthew is a writer and lecturer specializing in early American Orthodoxy and the Associate Director of the Society for Orthodox Christian History in the Americas.
Welcome back to American Orthodox History. Today we'll be continuing our series of interviews on past attempts to create a unified American Orthodoxy. And last time we did a two-part interview series with Father John Erickson on the subject of the Russian mission in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And today we're going to move into the 1920s and speak about the American Orthodox Catholic Church and an attempt to create a multi-ethnic jurisdiction in America in the 1920s. And my guest today is Father Andrew Stephen Damick, who is, he's a lot of things. He's priest of St. Paul Orthodox Church in Emmaus, Pennsylvania. He is one of the founding editors of the Orthodox Wiki website. He is a podcaster here on Ancient Faith Radio. He has an excellent new podcast, Orthodoxy and Heterodoxy. And he is the associate director, along with me, we're sort of co-associate directors of the Society for Orthodox Christian History in the Americas. And most relevant to our topic today, Father Andrew did his MDiv thesis at St. Tikhon's Seminary on Efthymios Aphish, Archbishop Efthymios Aphish, who is, as we'll see, the key figure in our story today. So, Father Andrew, welcome to the program, and maybe you could sort of give us a little bit of an introduction. Who was Efthymios Aphish?
Well, thank you very much. Archbishop Efthymios was the direct successor to St. Raphael of Brooklyn. He, like St. Raphael, was from what was then the Ottoman Empire, but while St. Raphael was from Damascus, Efthymios was from Lebanon, from the town of Bikfaya. And he came to the United States in 1905. When he was younger, he showed a strong piety and a great dedication to the life in the church. But even while he was in school and in seminary over in the old country, he was known as a bit of a rabble-rouser and participated in some stepping out against the authorities in some of the school because of their strictness and so forth. But he came here in 1905. He was already a priest when he came here, and he was 25 years old at the time. And when he came to the United States, St. Raphael, of course, had just relatively recently been consecrated to the episcopacy, and when he came here, he was one of St. Raphael's priests. And he served as a priest for St. Raphael for 10 years, and then in 1915, Raphael died. And there are photographs of St. Raphael's funeral, and one of these in particular is quite famous, where you see the saint's body laying out, and Archbishop Alexander Nemilovsky is behind the coffin, and then directly next to him is Efthymios Aphish, who was an archimandrite at the time, so he was quite instrumental in a lot of the central things that St. Raphael did while he was here. He served as the priest at the cathedral in Brooklyn and also served up in Canada for a while, and they knew each other very well. And then 2 years after Raphael's death, amidst great controversy, Efthymios was consecrated as his successor in the See of Brooklyn, overseeing the Syrian parishes under the Russian archdiocese. So that's essentially who Efthymios is, a very brief version of his life up until that point. And he then served as the bishop of the Syrian mission under the Russians for 10 years before the events that we're going to discuss today took place. And during most of that time, Efthymios found his career embroiled by controversies and tensions dealing with Metropolitan Yermanos Shahadi, who was a Lebanese metropolitan who came to the United States initially to raise money for his archdiocese back in Lebanon, but when after coming here, he found that he very much liked it here and tried to found his own jurisdiction, and in fact did, and I think it was in 1916 started his own Syrian diocese that competed with the Syrian diocese under the Russians. And so he was very much a thorn in the side of Efthymios Ophish. And Efthymios' career prior to the events we're going to be talking about today was not peaceful by any means, and largely consisted of his tensions and controversies against Metropolitan Yermanos. So
And this is the
Viagidas.
famous Rusi-Antaki schism that you're referring to here.
Right. This is the origin of the Rusi-Antaki schism, that Efthymios headed what was regarded as the Rusi faction, and Yermanos headed the Antaki faction. And of course, later on in the mid-30s, that would eventually solidify into two other kinds of factions, a New York archdiocese and a Toledo archdiocese. And largely the New York parishes were ones that consisted of parishes that had been under Efthymios and also had been under Metropolitan Victor, who was the first official Antiochian bishop in America. And the parishes that were part of the Toledo archdiocese mainly had been under Yermanos Shahadi. So this division really kind of went through two different phases, although that's not really what we're mainly talking about today, but it's really, really close to the center of this whole story.
So this was a time of real chaos in American Orthodoxy and division.
Absolutely. Lots of division.
And the Syro-Arabs were hardly alone in this. Now, I thought, this is mainly an interview, but I might give a little bit of some prehistory to what we'll be talking about today. Now that you've introduced Efthymios, I thought I might introduce the concept of the American Orthodox Catholic Church. I've done a bit of research on this. Those who are familiar with this podcast and also with our website orthodoxhistory.org, you will probably recognize the name Father Ingram Nathaniel Irvine. Irvine was a former Episcopal priest, and in 1905, so this would be the same year that Efthymios came to America, in 1905, Irvine was ordained a priest by St. Tikhon, ordained an Orthodox priest, and he was placed in charge of a new English department, is what it was called at the time, or an English-speaking department of the Russian mission. And he was based in New York and would celebrate church services in English. He wrote English-language articles on Orthodoxy in both Orthodox and non-Orthodox publications. He taught Sunday school. He assisted both St. Tikhon and then later St. Raphael with some of their English correspondence. He was an advisor to them. And after St. Tikhon returned to Russia in 1907, Father Irvine and his English department transferred to St. Raphael's oversight. So there was a close relationship already between the English department and the Syro-Arab mission. And then after St. Raphael died in 1915, they eventually transferred back to the Russian archbishop. Now, towards the end of Irvine's life, several Americans converted to Orthodoxy and became priests in the Russian mission and essentially joined his English department. And in 1920, this little group of American priests founded the first full-blown American convert parish, English-speaking convert parish, in New York. It's called Holy Transfiguration American Orthodox Catholic Church. And as far as I know, this is the first time the term American Orthodox Catholic Church was used. And Irvine was, by this point, an elderly man and was one of the assistant priests. And this parish, this Holy Transfiguration Church, seems to have lasted only a very short time. And Irvine himself died in January 1921. And after this, kind of ironically, the English department, which had by this point started to interchangeably use the name American Orthodox Catholic Church, it transferred with all of its priests to the oversight of Efthymios of Physh,
Right.
which is really ironic when you consider that Irvine, you referred earlier to the controversy surrounding Physh's, Efthymios' consecration. Irvine was right in the thick of this controversy.
Oh, absolutely. Irvine, was very much against Efthymios becoming a bishop. And then even after he was consecrated in 1917, Irvine continued to oppose him, mainly on the grounds that Efthymios had been a Freemason. And he acknowledged that Efthymios had repudiated any membership in the Freemasons, but said, once a Mason, always a Mason. And so he regarded any repudiation that Efthymios might have done as being ultimately disingenuous. And so he was tainted from Irvine's point of view.
And so ironically, after Irvine's death, his baby, basically, his English department, goes under Efthymios. And so there was some flux. I mean, these American convert priests, a number of them ended up leaving the Orthodox Church. New ones came in, and these included some names that we're going to see in today's discussion. Father Boris Burden and Father Michael Gelsinger, who came after Irvine's death during the period of Efthymios' oversight. And Burden and Gelsinger then became the new leaders of the convert clergy,
Right.
and they helped Efthymios come up with this plan for an American Orthodox Church.
Yes, exactly. And the English-speaking department, they came under Efthymios in 1922, and Irvine had died the year before. So it's possible that some of these men had gotten to know Efthymios even before Irvine's death, and found some kind of affinity with him, and so Alexander Nemilovsky, the Russian Archbishop, puts them under Efthymios, and in a lot of ways, I think it made some sense because, as you have mentioned in other things that you've written, and I can't recall if you put it on your podcast or not, but St. Raphael, his diocese used a lot of English. In fact, it was probably the most English-speaking jurisdiction in America at the time.
Oh, most certainly.
Yeah, and so it made a great deal of sense, at least from an administrative point of view, to put these priests under the administration of the bishop of the Syrian diocese under the Russians.
And so we have now, we're sort of in the 20s. You have a group calling themselves the American Orthodox Catholic Church, but what is essentially a department of Efthymios is his jurisdiction. From this, in 1927, we get a new jurisdiction. Maybe you could give us some backstory on that and sort of tell us how that happened.
Well, even as early as 1926, Efthymios had written some things saying that there needed to be a united jurisdiction in America. And, by that time, of course, the Russian Revolution was 9 years old. And it had worked a lot of chaos on the church there in Russia, but also, of course, here in the United States. And so for Efthymios, the solution to this problem was for all the Orthodox in America to unite into a single jurisdiction that was independent of any foreign influence. And so in this way, Efthymios was very much far-seeing, because as you know now, there's a lot of call for this from many people, that in our own time there's a call for creating a jurisdiction that's free of any foreign influence, and that all Orthodox in America should unite. So in a lot of ways, Efthymios sort of turned a prophetic eye on the American Orthodox situation. And so the American Orthodox Catholic Church, as something other than simply a name that the English-speaking department used for their activities, it came into being as a jurisdiction in February of 1927. And what happened in that month on February 2nd was that Metropolitan Platon, who was now the head of the Russian Archdiocese in America, along with all the members of his synod, which included Efthymios, signed into being a new jurisdiction called in full the Holy Eastern Orthodox Catholic and Apostolic Church of North America. And since that was a little bit unwieldy to say all the time, the short name was the American Orthodox Catholic Church. And when this jurisdiction was created, it was fascinating what kind of authority they signed it into having. And I have here a passage from the original decree that Platon signed. And they wrote this, that one of our number, His Eminence the Most Reverend Efthymios, Archbishop of Brooklyn, be given the full responsibility and duty of caring and providing for American Orthodoxy in the especial sense of Orthodox Catholic people born in America and primarily English-speaking, or any American residents or parishes of whatever national or linguistic character or derivation not satisfactorily provided with proper and canonical Orthodox Catholic care, ecclesiastical authority, teaching, administration of the Church, or who may wish to attach themselves by the properly and legally provided means to an autonomous, independent American Orthodox Catholic Church. So you can see that Efthymios was being given authority over not only English speakers who are already Orthodox, especially those born in America, but also he was being given authority to receive parishes that were independent and did not have any kind of canonical oversight to them, or any bishop. And then further beyond that, also to any Orthodox Christians who wanted to attach themselves to him. And so, although there was not an explicit giving of authority over all Orthodox in America, there was at least that potential. The potential existed with this apparatus that the Russian Archdiocese was officially creating in order to provide the possibility for a united church. Now, prior to this, just a few years before, in 1924, as students of this history will know, the Russian Metropolia, the Russian Archdiocese, had declared itself to be temporarily self-governing. And this was in response to the chaos emanating out of Russia as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. It was determined that they were unreliable and they could not depend on their support any longer, and so the Russian Metropolia declared itself to be temporarily independent. And so at least one of my speculations is that when Platon and his synod created, through Efthymios, the new American Orthodox Catholic Church, that their hope was that it would gain in legitimacy, that it would be recognized by the other jurisdictions in America, and that they would eventually join it, and that it would be recognized by the Orthodox of the old country, and that if that were to happen, based on the particular sort of legal language that they had used to create the jurisdiction, the Russian parishes could then be inserted into the new American Orthodox Catholic Church, and there would be a single independent Orthodox jurisdiction for all Americans who were Orthodox Christians. So
this sounds a lot like the OCA in 1970.
Yes, I think that the aspirations were very similar to the OCA. That, many people, when the OCA was founded, there was this hope that it would serve as this magnet, that all the other jurisdictions would eventually join, and then through that there would be created an independent American jurisdiction. As we know, of course, that hasn't happened yet, and it certainly did not happen with Efthymios' jurisdiction, and it failed, I think, for a lot of reasons, but one of them being that the Russian Archdiocese ultimately did not really give it full support.
So the Russian Archdiocese, the Synod of the Russian Archdiocese, creates this new jurisdiction with far-reaching authority, almost more than the Russian Archdiocese claimed for itself, and then doesn't end up joining it. So what was the relationship between this American Orthodox Catholic Church, this new jurisdiction, and the Russian Archdiocese?
Well, it was complicated. It wasn't clear exactly, actually, because initially the Russian Synod in America treats Efthymios as still being a member of it. So they regarded, there was overlap between Efthymios' jurisdiction and the Russian jurisdiction. Now, later on, some years later, the Russian Synod would declare that no one can be a member of two synods. That Efthymius could not be simultaneously the head of one synod and also the vicar in another synod, which is the position they had in the Russian synod. He was the vicar of the archbishop for the Syrian diocese. So it's not clear initially what the relationship was, and I think that ambiguity might have been deliberate. As I said, my supposition, and this is just speculation, I don't have any direct evidence for this, but my speculation was that they had hoped perhaps to use this new jurisdiction as a shell to insert what they were already doing, their existing parishes, into that. So, but you get the impression from reading the documents of the time that the Russians kind of bestowed this authority on Efthymios, kind of patted him on the back and said, "Okay, good luck." There wasn't really much in the way of real support. In fact, there was this kind of strange legal apparatus that was spelled out by Efthymios at one point to try to provide for the transfer of the Syrian parishes under the Russians into the new jurisdiction. And so the reason why I say that it was strange is because what he instructed them to do is that the parish would have to ask for a release from their current bishop, who was Efthymios, and then ask to be received by the bishop of the new jurisdiction, who was Efthymios. And so, it's kind of comical in a way, this sort of legalistic approach, which very much characterized a lot of things that Efthymios did. Efthymios liked to talk about canons a lot. He liked to talk about official jurisdiction a lot. He was, I think he had a certain dedication to the letter of the law that, in many ways, got in the way of his ability to be an effective pastor.
Now let's talk a little bit. We sort of talked a little bit about the Russian relationship with Efthymius and the new jurisdiction. What about the Greeks? They were the other ascendant, the new, sort of new jurisdiction that had been sort of formally established not too long before, and it had more people than any other jurisdiction in America. What was the relationship between the Greek archdiocese and Efthymius' new group?
Well, it's almost as soon as the declaration of the new group was made. A response actually came from the ecumenical patriarch eventually, later that year, denouncing the whole thing. And part of the denunciation was an instruction to the local Greek bishop, also named Alexander Demoglu, not to have any communion or relationship with the new jurisdiction whatsoever. And so there was, for a little while, there was a debate, a correspondence debate between Efthymios and the Greek Archbishop Alexander over the question, and it was based on the fact that Efthymios was drawing his authority from his understanding of the right of the Russian Archdiocese to be in America, that it had first jurisdiction, primacy in America, and so therefore Efthymios' jurisdiction, receiving its authority from the Russian jurisdiction, also had the right to be founded as a church in America and ultimately to be, hopefully, to be the one and only Orthodox church in America. And Alexander very much did not recognize this claim. He said not only did Efthymios not have the right to be the head of this new jurisdiction, but the Russians never had exclusive claim over Orthodoxy in America. And I think that one of the things that Alexander actually said was, the fact that the Russians had planted a flag up in Alaska does not give them jurisdiction all the way down to Florida. And in fact, Efthymius' claimed jurisdiction later on, when he wrote the Constitution for his new church, claimed jurisdiction not only over the United States, but also Canada and Mexico, and that he had exclusive missionary jurisdiction in all of South America. So Efthymius really, in a lot of ways, was claiming an authority that reached almost from Greenland to Argentina.
And Efthymius, this is really the origins. If those who have listened to this podcast are, I'm sure, familiar with, I've spoken of it a number of times, the myth of past unity.
Yes.
This story that once upon a time, all the Orthodox in America were united under the Russians, and it was only after 1917 that some of the Orthodox began to go away from this Russian authority. And I think I've demonstrated in the past that isn't an accurate reading of our history. But the origins of this myth can be traced directly back to Efthymios' new jurisdiction.
Right, exactly. In fact, before the American Orthodox Catholic Church was founded, history, as far as I know, and probably I'm sure as far as you know, does not record anyone making the claim that all Orthodox in America recognized the Russian jurisdiction. Now, some had made the claim, of course, that the Russians were the only ones that had a right to have jurisdiction in America, but that's a separate issue from the question of whether all the Orthodox in America recognized that supposed right. And the first time that anyone sees in writing the claim that all Orthodox in America had previously regarded the Russian Archdiocese as having sole jurisdiction here, the first time you see that was in a publication called the Orthodox Catholic Review. And the Orthodox Catholic Review was the official publication of the American Orthodox Catholic Church. And it was published in 1927. There were only 7 issues because eventually they ran out of money to publish it. And one of those issues was a double issue. So if you ever go researching this, there's only going to be 6 volumes to look at. One of the issues being having 2 volumes, two issues within it in one of the volumes. And in this American Orthodox, the Orthodox Catholic Review,
They're killing everybody in this game.
The main editor for the publication was Father Boris Burden, whom you mentioned earlier, was a member of the English-speaking department. And Father Boris, among other things, wrote a history of Orthodoxy in America, one of the first attempts to sit down and write such a project, and it was published in the Orthodox Catholic Review, and one of the claims that he made in it was that all Orthodox in America had previously recognized Russian jurisdiction, that they had recognized it prior to the formation of the Greek Archdiocese in 1921 and 1922. So this is the first case where we actually see some evidence of someone making this claim. And once again, to be clear, the claim that is being made is not who has the right to be here or who ought to have been here, but rather the claim was that all Orthodox Christians in America had recognized one jurisdiction. And that being the first time that anyone had made such a claim, and given the other evidence we've seen, for instance, the formation of the rogue Antiochian diocese under Yermanos Shahadi the year before the Russian Revolution took place, and some of the other things that you've gone over in your podcast, I think it's pretty clear that Boris Burden, despite making that claim, did not have any evidence to back it up.
Although it should be noted that Boris Burden didn't join the Orthodox Church until after there were already multiple jurisdictions. So it may well be that he, in some ways, just simply didn't know the history.
Right, that's possible that someone else maybe had passed on that idea, or that he was engaging in some conjecture.
And this isn't the only sort of controversial thing that's published in Orthodox Catholic Review. My understanding is that one of the reasons that the Russian Archdiocese decided they weren't so excited about the new jurisdiction was some anti-Episcopalian writings that appeared in the Orthodox Catholic Review.
That's right, and a number of the members of the English-speaking department who came under Efthymios and then became the publishing arm of the American Orthodox Catholic Church had been Episcopalians. And one thing that a lot of them shared with each other was a great hatred of the Episcopal Church in America. And so as a result, a lot of the things that they published in the Orthodox Catholic Review were very, very critical of the Episcopal Church. And this riled the Episcopalians, who at the time, along with the Church of England in general, were attempting to gain recognition from the Orthodox of the validity of their orders. That is to say, the Church of England wanted the Orthodox to look at them and in some sense say, yes, you are the church. You are part of the church. And one of the things that was written in the Orthodox Catholic Review was essentially that a kind of mocking thing saying, hey, if you're Orthodox and you would like some money from the Episcopalians, just hint that you might recognize their orders. And of course, there had been hints of that kind from the Ecumenical Patriarch and from some other sources. And of course, as you mentioned, Bishop Grafton had thought that St. Tikhon recognized episcopal orders, although he never did. And it ended their friendship when Tikhon ordained Father Ingram Irvine as a priest, indicating he didn't regard him as already being a priest under the Episcopalians. So it very much riled Metropolitan Platon, who was the head of the Russian archdiocese at the time. And Platon wrote a letter to Efthymios basically telling him to get his men under control because they received, and he explicitly said this, because we receive a lot of money from the Episcopalians. He said, in fact, he at one point said, our church in this country could not exist without them. And so it really bothered him, and that's one of the reasons that Platon started almost immediately, within a space of a year, started stepping back from this new jurisdiction that he had signed into being under Efthymios.
And the other thing that is worth noting is that Platon was actually, his cathedral had been confiscated. The Moscow Patriarchal jurisdiction, well, first the Living Church and then the Moscow Patriarchal jurisdiction had taken over Platon's cathedral. So he was actually serving, as his cathedral, he was serving in an Episcopalian chapel.
That's right. The church that he was in was called St. Augustine's Chapel. It was there in New York. And in 1926, Platon found himself in this church because he had lost his cathedral to the Living Church movement. And that chapel remained as the official cathedral of the Russian Archdiocese until 1943, when it moved into another Episcopal church. So the Russians, at least the Russians under Platon and then his successor Theophilus, were very much dependent upon the Episcopalians, and it was not helpful to them when Efthymios' men started poking them in the eye, quite frankly.
So Efthymios and his new jurisdiction, not recognized by the Greek archdiocese, not really on good terms anymore with their sort of mother, the Russian archdiocese. Who was a part of this jurisdiction?
Well, initially, I think most of the actual real parishes that adhered to Efthymios had been the ones that had been under the Syrian diocese under the Russians. It was not clear if any of them ever actually went through the ecclesiastical hoops that we mentioned earlier to ask for release from Efthymios and then ask to be received by Efthymios. It wasn't clear whether any of them actually did that. But he still regarded them as his parishes, and I guess in some sense they were part of the American Orthodox Catholic Church. Now, though part of the idea of the church was very much taken from the model that St. Tikhon had, in which St. Tikhon regarded his own jurisdiction as having one archdiocese under the Russian bishop, and then he wanted to have auxiliary bishops to head up various ethnic groups, pre-existing ethnic groups, and so he wanted to appoint bishops for them. And the one that he did was of course, St. Raphael for the Syrians. Efthymios' approach was a little bit different. He, instead of having a pre-existing group of parishes that he was going to appoint a bishop for, took the opposite approach, in which he wanted to appoint ethnic bishops as an attempt to attract parishes of that ethnicity into his jurisdiction. So he had bishops who probably didn't actually have many, or in some cases any, parishes that they were assigned to. But they were his auxiliaries. And so the first plan was to, besides Efthymios heading up Syrian parishes under the AOCC, there was the plan to make the way open for Russian parishes also to come under the AOCC. And this is one of the reasons that I have my speculation that Platon and his synod perhaps wanted to put Russian parishes into the new jurisdiction. And the bishop that was chosen for the Russian jurisdiction under the AOCC, under Efthymios, was a priest named Father Leonid Turkovich. And Father Leonid was in his late 40s at the time. He was a widower, and he had some small children. And the plan was to make him a bishop, to have a Russian ethnic diocese under Efthymios. And there was an independent Russian parish in Philadelphia. It was St. Nicholas on 7th Street, which today still exists, by the way. In fact, it's now a parish belonging to the OCA. But at the time, it was independent and did not have its own bishop. And so there was a man who was a parishioner at that church named Major Platov. And Major Platov was in the process of trying to conduct negotiations between Eftimios and the priest of that parish, Father Sinovsky, and bring them together and have Father Leonid Turkovich appointed as the bishop of that parish, and then that would be the headquarters for the new Russian diocese under Eftimios. Well, there was a lot of resistance initially to Turkovich becoming bishop under Eftimios, and the main reason was a practical one. He needed to provide for his kids, and Eftimios had no money to give him. And so he didn't want to leave life as a parish priest. Now, we should probably mention, of course, for those who are saying, Turkovich, that name sounds familiar, that eventually Father Leonid was consecrated as a bishop under the Russian metropolia, and then eventually became its head. He became its metropolitan as Metropolitan Leonti Turkovich, who is, I believe, now being investigated by the OCA for potential canonization, and who is buried at St. Tikhon's Monastery, right next to the church, in fact. But at the time, Father Leonid was not going to become a bishop because he just couldn't afford it. He didn't have the money. But it was interesting in that the initial documents signed by Platon and his synod provided for Turkovich to be consecrated as a bishop. That was the plan from day one. But because of his practical concerns with his kids, and also because of Platon very quickly backing off from supporting Eftimios, the support for the consecration of Turkovich ran up.
What about the dragon?
And eventually was scrapped. The whole plan was scrapped. But in the process of this, which took over a year to happen, Eftimios wrote a number of very plaintive letters to Platon, asking why you're turning your back on me, why you're withdrawing your support. You yourself elected Turkovich as a bishop, and now you're not helping me here.
And another bishop that did get consecrated was one of Eftimios' close associates, Emmanuel Abohateb.
Right, and Emmanuel had been the archdeacon of St. Raphael. And so in many photos of St. Raphael, you can see this deacon standing next to him. And that's Emmanuel Abohateb in many, many cases. And so Emmanuel was consecrated as Eftimios' first auxiliary. And then later on, another one was consecrated, Sophronius Bishara. And you can tell from both of their names that these men were both of Syrian descent. And so they both helped Eftimios to oversee parishes of Syrian tradition. And so the AOCC, at least initially, remained a largely very Syrian affair in terms of the actual makeup of its clergy and the bishops, and in most cases the parishes as well.
And so you had Bishop Emmanuel he was based in Montreal, I believe.
That's right, he was based in Montreal.
And then you had Sophronios Bishara, who was in Los Angeles. So
That's
I
right.
think probably the first Orthodox bishop to be based in Los Angeles.
I think that's probably true, yes.
And eventually Emmanuel Abohateb leaves Eftimios' jurisdiction.
Yes, I think it was in 1930. As the support was getting further and further withdrawn from the Russians to the new jurisdiction, eventually Eftimios starts to get very, very frustrated, as you may imagine. And in his frustration, in October of 1929, Eftimios issued a letter stating that he no longer recognized the authority of Metropolitan Platon. That when Archbishop Alexander Nemilovsky had left America some time before, that when he left, that authority in the archdiocese naturally devolved upon the first vicar of the Russian archdiocese, namely himself, that is Eftimios, and that when Platon came back to America, because Platon, you may remember, was the bishop of the Russian archdiocese in America from, I think it was 1907 to maybe 1914.
I think that's right.
And then went back to Russia, and then later came back to America as a refugee, fleeing the revolution. He was not sent as the appointment of Moscow, but when he came, he was kind of popularly acclaimed as the head of the Russian archdiocese. And so Eftimios took those particular set of circumstances and used them to say, look, Platon has no real authority here. I'm the head of the Russian archdiocese, and Platon has no jurisdiction. And so when that happened, when Efthymios repudiated his connection with Platon, shortly thereafter, I think it was early the next year in 1930, Bishop Emmanuel Abohatab told Efthymios, essentially, look, I can't be with you any longer. And then he petitioned for reception back into the Russian Archdiocese. And
he became the de facto head, basically, of the Rusi faction.
Yeah, not just de facto. I mean, he was appointed by the Russian Synod as being the head of the Syrian parishes under the Russian Archdiocese. And so when that happened, Efthymios, who had regarded himself as still being the head of those parishes, I mean, this was a major betrayal. And so in the letter that he wrote, sort of releasing Emmanuel, the language that he used is almost the language of a deposition. He doesn't quite come out and say you're no longer a bishop, but he does forbid Emmanuel from even visiting his parishes and communing there, having any authority or invitation in any of his parishes. So Efthymios was pretty bitter by this time. And at that point, there were now 4 different Antiochian jurisdictions in America. So let's count them. There was Efthymios' Syrian parishes, there was Emmanuel's Syrian parishes, Germanos Shahadi was still there with his Syrian parishes, and then there was the official delegation from the Patriarch of Antioch under Metropolitan Victor Aboasili. So in 1930, there were 4 different Antiochian jurisdictions in America, all competing with each other for authority and for parishes. It was a pretty sad
makes
situation.
Your head spin.
Yeah, it absolutely makes your head spin. Thank God there's only one. There's only one now. Thank God.
One of the other interesting elements of Efthymios' jurisdiction there were 2 other bishops. One of them a Ukrainian, the other an American.
Right, and as things really started winding down for the jurisdiction, and it must be said that the American Orthodox Catholic Church probably never really consisted of very many parishes. It was mostly a grandiose idea on paper. Now, it did have some existence beyond paper, but it was mostly just a big idea. But as the jurisdiction started winding down in its 6 or 7 year history, in 1932, Efthymios, in his attempt to bolster things up, first, I can't remember if it was in 32 or I think it might have been. He wanted to bring Theophan Noli to America to head up an Albanian diocese under his jurisdiction. Now, of course, Noli did eventually come back to America, having been here previously, and headed up a diocese of Albanians under the Russian Metropolia. But he never did come in under Efthymios, but Efthymios did succeed in consecrating 2 other bishops for ethnic dioceses under his own jurisdiction. And one was a man named Joseph Zuk, and following him were several Ukrainian parishes. And then the other was a man named William Albert Nichols, who was consecrated with the name Ignatius. And Ignatius Nichols was actually the first Orthodox Christian convert in America consecrated to the episcopacy. Although, of course, by that point, Efthymios' jurisdiction had a very dubious canonical existence. But I think we can say, with some hesitation, but we can say that Ignatius Nichols was the first convert bishop in American Orthodox history. Of course, his career in the Orthodox Church, I think, lasted less than a year. Ignatius had previously been an Episcopalian. He had also been an old Catholic bishop, had consorted with a lot of interesting people. And so he was probably a little bit of an opportunist and saw another opportunity to advance his own ecclesiastical career. And I think Ignatius Nichols is a particularly interesting figure because while Joseph Zuk was consecrated to take care of Ukrainian parishes, Ignatius Nichols was consecrated, quote-unquote, for the Americans. And he was given the title of Bishop of Washington. And besides just Americans, his purpose was to convert people, but especially to make use of the Western rite to convert Americans to Orthodoxy.
And so this is very interesting because we see the origins of, here's a Ukrainian jurisdiction that we should note is still with us today.
Right. That jurisdiction eventually comes under the Ecumenical Patriarch. So
and
yes.
then, so that is the the Ukrainian jurisdiction under the Ecumenical Patriarch today is a descendant of that original Bishop Joseph.
Right, at least
Ukrainians.
at least partly. And interestingly, the other half of that equation for the Ukrainians in America today were a jurisdiction under Yermanos Shahadi. Yermanos Shahadi, besides gathering Syrian parishes to himself, also had his own Ukrainian jurisdiction as well. And eventually both of those jurisdictions found their way into the Ecumenical Patriarchate and became respectively the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the USA and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Canada.
And so you have that that's one. We haven't really gotten to the point of talking about the legacy of the American Orthodox Catholic Church, but there's one piece of it. Another is, as you mentioned, the Western Rite.
Right, and Ignatius Nichols, even after the dissolution of the American Orthodox Catholic Church, he continued to use that name, and he started a group that was known as the Society of Clerks Secular of St. Basil. And the Society of St. Basil was a group of clergy under him who were celebrating the Western Rite. And eventually he consecrated a man named Alexander Turner to the episcopacy. Previously it would be called William Turner. And Alexander Turner was at first his auxiliary, and then when Ignatius left the project entirely, Alexander Turner became the head of this group of Western Rite parishes. And then in the late 50s and early 60s, he began having conversations with Father Paul Schnierla, who was a priest of the Syrian Antiochian Archdiocese under Metropolitan Antony Bashir. And Alexander Turner led his parishes into the Antiochian Archdiocese, and as a result, that is the origin of the Western Rite Vicariate in the Antiochian Archdiocese today.
So from this group that was really on paper, as you said, we're still seeing a lot of remnants today. And before we move on to the other remnants, I think we should probably sort of talk about the demise of the sort of final demise of Efthymios' jurisdiction. You had it was always kind of on the fringes of American Orthodoxy. Go ahead.
Yeah, it definitely had been on the fringes because, as we said, there were never really too many parishes. And so that was that was really the fatal flaw. Was it didn't really have too much in the way of a material existence. But as Efthymios started getting more and more frustrated, and one of the problems I think with him was that while his predecessor Saint Raphael had been known and is still known through his miracles as a reconciler and a uniter, Efthymios was a man that when someone opposed him, he put up a wall and thundered at them. And so he did not have the compassionate talent of his predecessor to unite people, but rather served to divide people. And so as support began to be withdrawn more and more, he became more and more frustrated and erratic. And eventually in 1932, there was one point where he published a letter threatening, in some sense, that the Orthodox public in America would see, I think he used the word a thunderbolt. I can't remember exactly the term right now, but he said essentially that something significant was soon going to happen, and that he had plans. And it was in late 1932 that he was called in to adjudicate a dispute at one of the few parishes that remained to him. And this parish was St. Mary's in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. This parish still exists today. And the dispute was regarding the priest. So Efthymios went there, and the priest had left, and so for several months, Efthymios served essentially as the parish priest. And while he was there, he met a young lady named Miriam Namey. And some
I should say no relation to me.
That's right, no relation to you. Her name was spelled differently, and of course, Namey is a common name over in the Middle East. In fact, it's spelled differently and so forth. But so Miriam Namey was a young lady. I think she was 19 or 20 years old, and she was a parishioner at St. Mary's in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And Efthymios, as he was giving a speech there, he met her. And she later on wrote a biography about him. And the scene that she gives of when they first met is very endearing. Efthymios, despite having been in America for for more than 25 years by that point, still had an accent as he spoke English. And so he was giving a speech at St. Mary's in Wilkes-Barre while he was there, and he used the English word obstacle. But instead of pronouncing it the way that you and I would, he said obstacle, which if you've met people with a thick Arabic accent, you know that's about the way they would say the word. And so after the speech was over, Miriam came up to him as everyone was getting his blessing, and she very quietly whispered in his ear, "It's obstacle, not obstacle." And that was the moment they had met. And that moment really endeared her to him. He was very taken by her. And of course, in 1932, he would have been 52 years old. So he was quite a bit older than she was. And later on, he asked her to head up the Sunday school program. And she said, no, I can't do that. I really need more training. And so he agreed to help train her. And they started doing a lot of lessons together privately. And you can kind of see where this is leading. Eventually, Efthymios left the parish, having appointed a new priest, and went up to Niagara Falls and was serving there. And while he was there, he eventually sent a telegram to Miriam and asked her to come up there. And so on April 19th in 1933, just a couple of weeks after Pascha, the two of them stood in front of a justice of the peace and were legally married. And she had gone up there by night train, and then a few days later, her father in Wilkes-Barre was contacted asking his opinion of what had happened, and he said that he wished to see neither one of them ever again. It was a big
and that
scandal.
That was sort of the sentiment of a lot of the Orthodox in general. And we, as we sort of wind down this interview, Efthymios' jurisdiction, which was already sort of on its way out of the mainstream of American Orthodoxy, pretty much dealt a death knell by this marriage.
Right. When that happened, none of his parishes wanted anything to do with him. It was what killed it. All signs indicate that he intended to try to function as a bishop after that. And in fact, he made claims. He said that the canons governing celibacy for bishops only applied to bishops over in the old country, and that it had nothing to do with America, despite it coming out of the canons of the ecumenical councils. Efthymios claimed that it really was just a foreign canon, had nothing to do with him. And now when that happened, shortly thereafter, a synod, quote-unquote, was held by two of Efthymios' auxiliaries, namely Ignatius Nichols and Joseph Zook. And when they met together to discuss what Efthymios had done, they issued a statement congratulating him on his marriage and restating Efthymios' claim that the canons regarding episcopal celibacy only applied to the old country. But then they also congratulated him on his retirement. So at the same time, recognizing the legitimacy of what he had done, they also distanced themselves from him. And at that same meeting, the two of them elected Joseph Zook to be the head of the jurisdiction, with Ignatius as having the right of succession. And in the following year, in 1934, Joseph Zook dies, and Ignatius kind of strikes out on his own and briefly goes into communion with the representatives of the Living Church, the Soviet Living Church here in America, for just a little while, and then went completely independent and began consecrating lots of different men as bishops on his own authority. And so, we mentioned the legacy of the American Orthodox Catholic Church, and one of its legacies is that there are many, many, many bishops throughout the world, so-called bishops, who claim to be Orthodox or Catholic, or sometimes they'll call themselves Anglicans, who claim to derive their episcopal succession from Efthymios Ophish. And so usually when Efthymios' name is mentioned amongst Orthodox, people will use the word vagante, which is a Latin word meaning wandering, meaning a sort of independent bishop that has no real church and is not really a bishop. But Efthymios Ophish, I think, would never have wanted that word applied to himself, and never did anything to deserve it. He consecrated bishops, as far as I can tell, from all the evidence I've looked at, he consecrated bishops only while he had a jurisdiction that was still in some sense part of the Orthodox Church. And it was Ignatius who later struck out on his own and became the ecclesiastical Lone Ranger. And so all of these people, most of them anyways, who claim succession from Efthymios, really had their succession through Ignatius. And there are some also who claim succession from Efthymios who got it from Sophronius Bishara, who, among other things, later on with Theophan Noli consecrated Christopher Contageorge as a bishop who gave the Greek archdiocese lots of headaches later on. And so then Christopher Contageorge then consecrated some men as well. So we can see that even though there's a lot of these episcopi vagantes, these wandering bishops, who claim to get their lines of succession from Efthymios, really they don't get it directly from him. They get it from the extremely erratic actions of one of his auxiliaries, mainly Ignatius, and then also through at least one act by the other, Sophronius Bishara. So,
and Sophronius and Joseph, the two of the bishops, they die.
That's right. They both died in 1934.
And so they died. Ignatius leaves. He sort of disappears. Goes off, on his own. I shouldn't say disappears, and does his own thing. And Efthymios is done. He's basically retired for all intents and purposes. And the priests who were the guys who drove the engine of the church, the new jurisdiction, Michael Gelsinger and Father Boris Burden, they went their separate ways as well, returning to mainstream Orthodoxy.
That's right. Father Boris Burden joined the newly founded Russian Exarchate in America. This was another Russian jurisdiction founded in 1933 as an official arm of the Moscow Patriarchate. So at that time, you had the Russian churches under the Metropolia, temporarily self-governing. You also had a faction under the Rokor. You also had the representatives of the Soviet Living Church, and then you had the official representative of the Moscow Patriarchate. So in 1933, there were 4 Russian jurisdictions in America. And now there's only 3. And then Father Michael Gelsinger, perhaps the more interesting of those two figures, he became part of the Syrian Antiochian Archdiocese under Metropolitan Antony Bashir, who was appointed as the head of the Antiochian Archdiocese of New York in 1936, following the death of Metropolitan Victor Apoasoli. And Father Michael Gelsinger, a fascinating figure. He had labored a lot, especially on getting Orthodox music set to English translations. And in fact, many Orthodox in America are probably not aware that many of the musical pieces that they're even still using today, a lot of them were originally put together by Father Michael Gelsinger to traditional melodies and settings, and I think he did a little bit of his own compositions. And Father Michael was particularly dedicated to the use of English. And in the course of my research, I found a letter that Father Michael had written to Metropolitan Antony Bashir many years after all of these things happened, in which he very clearly said that he believed that if the Syrian Archdiocese in America, the Syrian Archdiocese of New York, that is, under Metropolitan Antony, was to have any future, it really had to stress the use of English. And as we know, Metropolitan Antony was very much a champion of English. And so one of the men standing, beside his throne on this particular issue was Father Michael Gelsinger, who I think had a prophetic word to say to him. Probably maybe didn't give him the idea, but certainly encouraged him in the idea and did a lot of the grunt work for him. So Father Michael's legacy is massive in American Orthodoxy, and I think his name is not really as well known as maybe it should be.
And I'm sure we'll be doing a whole podcast on him as well.
I
in the
hope
future.
so. I hope so.
And so you have, and this I don't want to go into too much detail on all this because partly because we'll be talking about it in some episodes shortly to come, but Gelsinger and Burden also were involved in some future efforts to bring about to foster some unity among the Orthodox in America. One of the in particular, I'm talking about the Federation, the Federated Primary Jurisdictions. This was a proto-SCOBA organization that we'll actually be talking about on our next episode.
That's right, and I think one of the things that's interesting about this whole story is that the larger story, I think, is the story of the English-speaking department. You know, starting with Father Nathaniel Irvine and continuing on under the Russians and then under Eftimios. And then eventually after the dissolution of the AOCC, these guys all go into different jurisdictions. But they maintained a correspondence with each other even after this. They still regarded themselves as having a kind of affiliation with each other. And they used those links to help to pursue American Orthodox unity. And so this federation and SCOBA and all these things very much owe a lot to the work of the English-speaking department, which of course owes its genesis to Father Nathaniel Irvine.
And so I think that's probably a good place to wind down. We see the AOCC failed for some obvious reasons. The personality at the center of it, namely Eftimios, and also the lack of really the support of the other jurisdictions, the lack of much, in terms of its own jurisdiction beyond just being on paper. It didn't have many parishes and so forth. It was, in many respects, it's easy to see why it didn't work out. But it's also sort of remarkable to consider the massive legacy, both on the positive side and to some extent on the negative, but mostly positive, that this jurisdiction had and still has in the history of American Orthodoxy. So, Father Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today on the program, and I would want to let everyone else know, if you're interested at all in any of these subjects that we've just discussed, as always, please visit our website, orthodoxhistory.org. I know I will have a bunch of supplemental material up, and I'm sure Father Andrew might contribute some supplemental material as well. So we'll have all kinds of stuff for you to read on the website. And next time on the podcast, we'll be talking with Father Oliver Herbel, who is going to speak with us about that federation that we mentioned earlier, an effort in the 1940s to foster American Orthodox unity. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to American Orthodox History with Matthew Namey. Matthew is a writer and lecturer specializing in early American Orthodoxy and the Associate Director of the Society for Orthodox Christian History in the Americas. For supplemental material related to this episode, please visit orthodoxhistory.org. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. On the web,
very interesting. Hey, thanks for watching. You can find more VODs here on YouTube, as well as other projects, including reviews of games I've played and movies I've watched. You could also stop by the channel, Orthodox Oasis, over on Twitch. Join us live, hang out, say hi, and all that good stuff. Otherwise, thanks for watching. This has been the Orthodox Oasis. My name is Jerome Hieronymus, and may the Lord bless you and keep you always. Bye.